Check, mic check. Okay, people. This is Addy Ads, Anakin Skywalker, YouTube's chosen one. This is COVID Roundtable Round 3. And I am pleased to be joined by Dr. Jay Couey. Jay, how you doing?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm doing well, sir. Oh, and looks like Doc McCairn just joined as well.
Good morning.
McCairn, how you
Of course
doing?
he did.
Good morning.
How
So,
late am I? Oh, I'm
oh,
just.
we actually just started, Doc. Yeah, literally, I broadcasted right at the top of the hour and just entered the lobby just now as Doc Couey entered as well. So
Okay,
it's
so
good timing.
yeah, you're lucky because I was flat out asleep again. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, I'd been up, but I got up really early and was just I zoned out on the sofa. So
Yeah, I saw you broadcasting again pretty late last night, Doc McCairn.
it was it was just a pre-recorded thing that I did. I'm trying to line up grifters, and I guess in terms of no virus or virus deniers, I guess for want of a better vernacular, it's the 5G I'm having to get to now. So we can we'll see how that sort of plays out over the next week or two, because there's much more material there to deal with, and
Yeah, and we should definitely get into that too this evening. Well, I don't know, depending on who you want to talk about, Doc McCairn, because I did see you list at least one other person in a video you posted besides Dr. Kaufman. I know.
yeah, so that was the new guy who I was Batur. I don't know how you pronounce his name. One of those exotic sounding ones, and the reason I did it was because I think I'd sort of done a good enough job with respect to Andrew Kaufman. I don't think there's much coming back from his position, and
Doc Cottrell will be joining us later. He said he has another interview. I think he was doing or ending. Is it overlap? So he said he's going to be here in about half an hour or so. But yeah, we can start with that, Doc McCairn, if you'd like. Pretty open ended as far as tonight goes. I don't know, as far as the political scene, what I've noticed, and I think other people have too. It seems like although things still are changing quite quickly, it has slowed down a bit even from last week. And maybe like there was kind of like, I don't know, like maybe a good 3.5 or 4 weeks there where it was just kind of crazy, and it kind of seemed to calm down a bit last week. But despite that, it still is changing all the time.
yeah, I mean, and that's something I think you guys are gonna probably be more informative than I am, because I'm not in the United States, and my my sort of view is that you've got this window where you have to be locked. It's not locked down. They haven't locked you down. They've given you a suggestion to stay indoors, and or not even that, right? I mean, you can go out and do your essentials, but you can't. There's not police on every corner, and I think it's less. It's not Wuhan, right? China right now, and it's a case of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, because I would argue that locking down the way that you did probably did mitigate some of the impact of the disease itself. But then in doing that, everyone then starts saying, well, oh, why did you do that then? Or obviously it's not as bad. So why lock us all up? And and that's how I sort of see it from the outsider. And yeah, like I say, probably the two of you have more to say than I do in that respect, because for me it doesn't look any different.
Yeah, what's it looking like for you, Doc Couey, in Pittsburgh?
Well, I don't know about Pittsburgh. I mean, we have a few hundred cases here, or 800 or something in Pennsylvania. I don't know exactly what the count is. Everybody's being careful here and wearing masks generally now, and social distancing is still set in. I think for me, I'm trying to stick to the literature. The latest preprint that I think is interesting, although it is a preprint, has a single author, Knut Witkowski, this guy who is one of these epidemiologists that came out and said that the only way out of this is herd immunity, and so we just have to figure out how to get there as soon as possible. He just produced a paper which has 15 some odd figures in it, and it uses the standard model for respiratory infections that's been used by all the epidemiologists in history, or at least in the recent history. And so it's a pretty standard model of how these epidemics work. And he makes a very seems mathematically sound argument for the social distancing thing only has a significant effect when it's implied at specific times in relation to the biological peak of the disease. And by his best estimations, we closed down most places in the United States too late or too early. And in either case, the consequences are either nothing really or super significant. And if you close down too early, what you do is you prevent the population from ever reaching a peak which is capable of generating any significant herd immunity. And so then you've just kicked the can down the road, and you're still going to hit the same peak, but you're going to lose a few people on the run up to it. You're going to lose a few more because you spread it out. And the other side of it is if you do it too late, then it has almost no effect at all. And the interesting part of the paper is that he makes a very nice summary about the maximum gains. And the maximum gains in all of these scenarios are about 10%. So it doesn't really matter how bad or how well you apply these measures. The only sort of change that you can have in terms of the total amount of people that will die this season from it, or this exposure to it, is about 10%. So it's not to say that those 10% people aren't worth trying to save those 10%. Of course it is. But it's a very tricky mathematical dance because of the way that all of these phenomena work. So it just gives you kind of this sort of range of biological possibilities is quite a bit narrower than I think a lot of people are painting it.
That's really interesting, Doc Couey. Do you think that we did lock down too early in some places?
Well, I think Knut would make that argument, and in his paper he does, and he uses different countries' current progression and correlates their application of lockdown and shows several examples of both good and bad results that he thinks correlate with whether they got it right and closed down right at the peak, or whether they closed down too early or closed down too late. Okay. It's an interesting paper because he's been on YouTube on a few things and on a few videos and sort of been misquoted and oftentimes lumped into these people who don't understand how these things work, even though he actually does. I mean, he worked at Rockefeller University for 20 years as an epidemiologist, so he's not speaking from no experience. The tricky part is, of course, why we're all together is that if this virus is not just some run-of-the-mill coronavirus, but it has some extra abilities or things that make it behave as an atypical respiratory virus, then all of the things that Knut knows may not apply to this virus. So that's the trick.
Yeah, that caveat is important, but it's really interesting how you explain that, Doc Couey, and I would love it if you send that over to me. It'd be I'll probably put it in the show notes too, in case anybody else wants to check it out. Likewise, Doc McCairn, if you have any papers that you think anybody watching would be like, okay, yeah, that's something I could read in my free time. I could add those to the show notes as well. Just so if they pop in your head at any point this evening.
Well, I mean, the literature that I'd sort of honed in on this week was there'd been a few more primate studies that came out, and
Nice. Give us a review. Give us a review.
Well, okay, I think it's probably, you sort of have to wind the clock back a little bit, and that just goes back to the original SARS outbreak from I can never get the pronunciation right, Guangdong province, the in the sort of southeast part of the country, and the first case arose of SARS there, sort of late 2002 into 2003, and how do I know Guangdong University, and obviously for the province itself, is that they have one of China's more established primate colonies. It's a private, it's public colony, and unlike the Wuhan facility, which would be much tighter facility and very, very opaque as to the.
Can I ask you a side question quick, Kevin?
Sure.
What I heard recently that some very big primate guy in Germany actually just moved to China last year. I don't know his last name, but he's like a world famous primate fella, and he moved his whole lab to China. Do you know who I'm talking about, or is this more not such a rare occurrence? I don't know.
Well, the fire hose of cash that China sprays at people, I think that becomes a very tempting offer at different times of your career. And the only person that really springs to mind that would sort of have any overlap with myself is Logothetis. And
that's it. Yes. Okay.
If that was him, there is there's a sort of bit of history there as well, and he basically, I want to say, it's getting on a bit now, but I want to say 5-6 years ago, maybe a little bit more. I'll see if I can pull it up. But Logothetis basically wrote a I can never remember. It's one of those names that's nigh on impossible to pronounce and even more difficult to spell. And he wrote a open letter to, I want to say it was probably Nature, and sort of simultaneous press release as well. And it was a sort of stamp your feet hissy fit that he, and I want to say he was in Tübingen. I think he might have been Tübingen or one of those around that area. And Tübingen is a nice little spot of Germany, and I'm guessing him sort of upping sticks would have been quite a sort of difficult decision to make. Obviously, the Bavarian countryside has a lot of appealing aspects to it, and but the reason he left was because, and maybe I'll get onto a bit of a rant about that, is that the animal rights and the sort of left-leaning political groups basically had been trying tooth and nail to, and had somewhat got into his lab, because as he was part of the university, the system there, that he and they brought him under pressure for like the most innocuous of violations, and literally I'd have to sort of look back to sort of remember exactly what it was, but they'd literally made his life a sort of living hell. And in Europe, you know, that does mean you have to have your car swept for explosives every day, you know, as you go to work. And with kids in your house, you probably got to have safe rooms or somewhere that you can hit for a panic. And so anyway, it was a huge scandal at the time. Well, not a scandal as such, but you know, people were like, "Oh wow, you know, if Logothetis is sort of giving up the game, then basically that sort of would sound the death knell of primate research in Europe." And in that sense, he was probably right, because there's very, very little primate research in. Let me just see if I can. I want to. Now it's bothering me that I can't remember the exact reason. Okay.
But the reason why I was bringing it up is because I tried to figure out if there was an easy way to find out what kind of animals were being used in Wuhan, but I haven't really been able to find.
Yeah,
like,
you
I
won't.
would love to have a primate publication from there, because that would be.
Yeah, you won't, and this is you won't find like primate publications, especially. Well, there was some with respect to SARS initially, but I think what the Chinese were doing was complying basically with what they considered to be international norms. In January this year, I'm looking at. So he's in Science. This movie.
Yeah, so it was more recent. It was more recent.
Yeah. Well, no, his move.
So much.
His move was, but and he's with Pu Muming as well, and that's a well, not unsurprising. Pu Muming has a lot of clout within China, but like I say, it was. I said this maybe give me some idea of the 2014 German TV broadcast footage filmed by. So it wasn't far off. I said 5-6 years, right? So I've sort of had it, and on the spot questioning like that. Shame on you, Jonathan. Put me on the spot. But
well, somebody was asking about the Swedish herd immunity, and I don't know about you guys, but Twitter seems to be the best place for info. So yeah, I did find this one. It's so Finland's at 13 deaths per million, Norway 28, Sweden 119, and Netherlands 183. So this guy says it doesn't seem to be working. Their herd immunity philosophy.
Well,
that's so much assumes so many things, though. Their denominator and their numerators are both based on imaginary numbers, right? I mean,
yeah.
You have to assume that all their testing is correct and everything else, and they're not. Then they're testing everyone, and they're not. And the same thing's happening here in the United States. The numbers can be shifted to become immediately worse than the flu or easier than the flu, depending on how you want. Right now, there's a guy on Twitter named the Ethical Skeptic, and if you haven't followed him, you should look him up. The Ethical Skeptic has been making charts and graphs about the numbers that the CDC is releasing, and he's noticed that since they've shifted to including cases that are suspected but not confirmed, we've stayed on the exponential growth curve. But before they made that switch was like 7 days ago. That guy. Before that, he noticed that we were actually on the decline. That latest figure is that one right there. So the dotted line is showing you where we were headed and that would have made it a pretty bad flu, right? 1/10 of 12%, 1/10 of 1%, and now it's back up to some crazy, 7% possibly, if that curve is correct, and that's only because they added the suspected diagnosis option. So the doctors are more inclined, and you have to understand also not to create any, but there's genuine reason for them to increase the number of COVID patients, because the legislation which was passed 2 weeks ago, the CARES Act, has in it a very specific clause that reimburses hospitals for COVID cases. So if the hospitals want money from that thing, the more cases they have, the more money they're going to get. So the doctors are being told, whether we like it or not, to diagnose everybody with COVID, like especially the people who die. So there's a reason for them to flub the numbers, and that's starting to work against us in terms of interpreting the real course of the pandemic and what to do next. That's a problem.
Yes, it is. And again, you're sort of falling into this very, for want of a better word, ambiguous political territory with the United States.
I agree. It's terrible. They're playing this game on purpose, though, and that's the reason why I'm skeptical of it. I'm not saying that the shit is not bad, but I'm saying that they're mucking up the numbers is really creating a panic that doesn't need to be created. We could all be working together with a common cause, but because of this extremely contrasting information, people are reacting very poorly right now here, and it's not good. That's why you have these protests in Michigan and in Harrisburg and everywhere else trying to open these states up. It's just absurd.
And if I just wanted to speak to the I don't want to stop your flow, Jonathan, so if you had more to say, just cut me off. But just as a sort of personal anecdote, watching the people in Michigan, I was dismayed to sort of see that type of course, I understand that people are worried about the overreach of the federal government, and in the American context, that always makes sense, because I want America to have that streak. And but it just seemed like teenagers giddy with their first date or something, where of all the other times where there are people who are always going on about they're coming to take my guns and my whatever thing that they want to sort of glob onto with the social dynamics of the United States, in doing what they're doing, where they're sort of forcing the hand of the current administration. And I'll sort of go on record at this point that I don't think it's very difficult in my mind to see how the president could have done things any different. And he did do things a lot earlier, and I felt he was hamstrung at multiple levels, just not even just including this current issue, but I've never seen anything like the sort of bizarre political landscape that's existed. There's usually some oddities of the United States, of course, but I've never seen anything so bizarre as the pushback that a new president would get. And I thought it seemed bad with Obama and sort of what were Tea Party type demonstrations, but they haven't let the current president be able to sit still for a minute because of the constant stream of making issues where there aren't any, be it sketchy MI6 dossiers and surveillance prior, even before he became president, right, to the Russiagate impeachment, right? And people have to remember all that was rolling on, all of the one after another, and he was supposed to react in a measured manner in response to something that humanity in our current lifetimes have never had to deal with before. It just smacks to me of political gaming and trying to get a political one-upmanship, and I guess to sort of tie it back round to what Jonathan was saying with the you've got different the spread across the country, because it's a massive continent, of course, are at different places, and so now they sort of force their hand of, well, we're going to put some states back to work, etc., and it might just have undone everything with respect to sort of biting the bullet when they did. That's what I would add to that.
Yeah, well said, Doc. I don't really have much to add to that, but yeah, go ahead, Doc. Couey.
No, I just wanted to keep back on topic. You were going to tell us about a couple primate papers that you recently.
Oh, right. So as I sort of, and I'd like to sort of project an air of all-knowing, but the simple fact is that when you're sort of in the research lab doing your own research, you tend to sort of stick close to your field of interest, and infectious disease was not my thing, and so I'd peripherally known about I knew about Guangdong province and their primate facilities, but had I really in any way sort of kept an eye on anything to do with SARS, or not really, because it wasn't of great interest to me as such. I mean, there was, I remember I'd seen papers about the potential for using it. It had a potential for the neurotrophic components, but again, that's all very sort of hazy. So, I started to sort of dig around, and a few papers popped up on preprint servers, I want to say in the last week or two. And these basically confirmed. And so the confirmation of the testing within animals. So I'm getting a lot of pushback from virus deniers and all those that want to think that it's a big conspiracy by
Shout out to Dr. Young.
Oh, right. Yeah. He's not here today. He didn't want to come in. Because of these sort of individuals, we'd like I said, we've been sort of hamstrung, and my sort of train of thought had gone. I had something that I was gonna. Yes, I know. So when SARS first sort of broke onto the scene, and it was in that province. I keep butchering it, so I feel stupid kind of saying it. But where SARS first broke out, that primate facility probably had much to do with like the initial handling. And if we were to edge towards the more conspiratorial, as the bats and the first outbreaks were there as well, I'm just wondering if there'd been some earlier instantiation of the disease in that region, and there was some passage through the or through testing with macaques, the Chinese, they're not that concerned about their own citizens. They're less concerned about monkeys in a lab, and they would have for sure done experiments that would have probably struggled to get ethical approval. Now, if you sort of follow the history, so the testing in primates of the original SARS, some groups, so I probably should get my names right, so I will do my due diligence, and it's
I
an
think
easy
it's
search.
Guangdong, the pronunciation.
Guangdong, yeah,
Guangdong.
yeah. So, and no doubt the Chinese say it different, but so if you just go into or Google and you just Google primate models and monkeys and SARS, sorry, so primate models and SARS, you get a bunch of hits that should come to the top for you. And one of those is an article that was published in 2006. And this man, as a somewhat seasoned academic, I'm going to.
Oh, is this Hagman's in Osterhaus?
It's not that there's a response. It's a response to them, and I want to say so. The Hagman's and Osterhaus, I think, were the one of the groups which were publishing what seemed to be a successful transfection of SARS into non-human primates. But in response to that, and I want to say that was, I want to say the letter was in +1 as well.
Hogan?
Is it Hogan? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, he's. Let's see. Yeah, so he's. I think he's sort of saying. He goes on to record to say that Hagman's and Osterhaus were essentially not forthcoming with respect to their agents, and there was a lot of back and forth as to how useful monkeys were, and monkeys were a very hot. It's been a very hot potato for many years now, especially in Europe. It started to infect the United States as well, not long after, and the Luddites and sadly it's not kids, it's young adults, I would say, but you know, you're getting you get a particular demographic from universities, and hang on, I'm going to try and bring up the letter because I want to quote him properly, and
So while you look that up, Doc McCairn, perhaps Doc Couey could answer this question we got from Marie. She says, do we know if people can become immune after infection? I'm assuming she means after they recover.
So I'm not a medical doctor. You're asking the wrong guy, but I can tell you what I know. I know that they believe that they can see extended antibody titers after infection. I also know that there's evidence from mares and patients who had mares, which is this Middle Eastern camel version of this virus, that if you're given an antiviral drug like remdesivir too early in the course of your infection, then you won't develop antibodies and you'll still be completely naive to the infection should it come back. So there's good reason to believe that there are several different reasons why the reports of 2 times in a row becoming infected or reinfection of people who used to be positive and then recovered and then became positive again, there's reason to believe that that can occur for a wide range of reasons, all coming from different angles of how this disease manifests itself and how the immune response manifests itself to it. But there's no reason to believe that this is somehow special biologically, that we can't become immune to it. It's just what percentage of people who get sick and recover are now immune to it should it come around again? I have no reason to believe it wouldn't be like any other flu, in the sense of, if the flu doesn't change very much from this year to next year, we'll all be fine and most of us won't get it. And if it changes a lot more of us will get it. So I think the same thing can be said for this virus. If it doesn't tend to change very fast as it moves through our population, then when we get exposed to it again after we've had it once, we should be okay. And if enough of us get exposed to it before it gets to our geographic region, it's possible that we'll never get exposed to it. It's possible, but it's not very likely anymore, because so many of us are infected. That happened with SARS because it just apparently didn't crack the threshold for, like, endemic spread.
Yeah,
This
they put the cap on the bottle real early on that one, because that one would have been way worse than this one. No, I mean,
But
it
I
was
think it
way
still
more
got
deadly.
more than 1 million people. Like, more than 1 million were infected, I think.
Oh wow,
I mean,
okay.
Not so many. It just took a lot longer to get to 1 million. Now we're already there, right? I mean, I think SARS got to 1 million in 2 years of it slowly being snuffed out.
Well, what sort of speaks to that, and I want to make a point. So on my streams this week, a good friend of mine was speaking, and it's important to remember that even though Guangdong, whoever is it, King Kong, Bing Bong province, said or the Chinese authorities were lackadaisical at the time with respect to reporting, and it was the Canadians' infrastructure and program that was set up that sort of caught the first the breaking of this and the emergence of it onto sort of more international, or kicked into gear sort of international infrastructure. The same thing seems to have happened again from the Chinese, and it's good to clean house on our side, and I don't think we should lose this opportunity to do so, and we should get into that in a bit. But what I want to speak about is that at a later bit, I'll get the monkey stuff out of the way first, but the it's the fact that the Chinese Communist Party are not your friends, right? And for those that sort of especially of a younger persuasion, feel inclined, and I know it's normal when you're that age to sort of err towards what seems like an egalitarian way of looking or trying to shape the world, and it doesn't seem to make sense to people, especially the sort of ideologically more possessed that they are, that we're not doing things in a fair way. And I do realize that we have our own issues in the West, especially as we've turbocharged everything with hyper competitiveness and then hyper reward, and the that has problems. So I might just want to keep that on. Make a note of that, Addy, if we can sort of maybe pull the conversation around to that.
Yeah, we want to put a pin in that one.
Yeah, and let me just I want to use the exact words that the Robert Hogan used, and I don't know this person personally, and so it's not any sort of personal animosity between me and him, other than what I would perceive to be potential conflicts of interest. And he wrote a quick letter which was, are non-human primates good for modeling, or good models for SARS is the correct title. And he wanted to respond to the Hagman and Osterhaus paper, and in his last paragraph, well, his argument is that the primates don't make good models for SARS because the infection seems to be unpredictable, much like it is with humans. And then in that context, I would use the I would use that fact to say all the more reason to be using primates under these circumstances. And so he sort of finishes his letter to the journal. It's a long paragraph, so please please bear with me. So it says, perhaps the most interesting issue is that Lawler and colleagues, so this is another group, state that SARS, I won't do that, but SARS generation 1 infection of cynomolgus macaques did not reproduce the severe illness seen in the majority of adult human cases of SARS, to his knowledge. Only Osterhaus's laboratory and laboratories from China have reported severe disease in SARS infected macaques. Osterhaus mentions that the variability in results may be due to factors such as the strain of the virus used, which is critical. Keep that in mind. And this is certainly true, he says. However, he has not released the virus isolate used in these studies to me or my colleagues in spite of requests, given that so many groups, e.g. the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, etc., which the last two are part of Dr.
Wow,
Fauci.
this is a fantastic finding. It makes me very excited.
Okay, this is Fauci's little fiefdom. With excellent scientific skills and credentials, have reported contradictory results with at least 2 strains of SARS. It is troublesome that the use of non-human primates in SARS pathogenesis vaccine and therapeutic testing continues. And I would just
I need that link. You need to send me that link.
I'll put it in the the comments right now.
Oh my gosh, I need to read that. I need to follow that whole bibliography again. Wow.
So
fantastic finding.
So
why would he not send that? That's the question, right?
Well, so of course there may be, and we need to dig into the other people.
Holy crap!
Whatever their names were, Hagmans and Osterhaus. We need to dig into them a bit more and see
if they've left the country.
No, I mean not so much. I mean they're in the
Osterhaus is in the Netherlands, isn't he?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah.
And he's
at the same lab that Fauci's at. Fauci's the guy who did the ferret flu stuff in 2011.
Yeah,
he's in the same institute.
So those, I don't think they've gone anywhere because they did publish data in 2011 with sort of another SARS still. I think I want to say that study was, but the thing to sort of keep in mind is that scientists, as they climb up that greasy pole, become ever more sort of corrupt, drunk with power, and it's harder and harder to find people with what you would consider good intent or good intentions with respect to what you would think would be scientific questions in the interest of the public. And so you could only be guessing right now what would be the bad blood between them. But I guess as
But I think one point to make here is that this is not an email. This is a published letter.
Yeah.
So this is extremely well-chosen language, maybe even run past a lawyer. Like, this is some serious stuff to publish. Like, it's not an email that we got through secondhand connections or something. This is a publicly published text which says something's fishy here. And that's a very bold statement to make in this context, I think.
I would just put it down right now. I would say give it the benefit of the doubt that people did try in transfection, right? Because you get into this whole issue of Koch's postulates with respect to disease, and that's a lot of what I've been sort of trying to sort of nail down, especially with the viruses that aren't real.
So we got a just quick question from looks like this girl Juliet, just a recap of what we're talking about. So Doc McCairn just sent me this particular published study, and Doc McCairn, do you want to explain it a little bit? Could you just do a paraphrase, perhaps?
So that's the letter that was published in response to the original paper, which let me just put the link for the paper, which is just simply entitled "Non-Human Primates Models of SARS." It's in the same journal, and let's just see what the author's response is as well. Let's just grab that link, and my response to Hogan would be, that man is an idiot, I would say, coming from my perspective with respect to primate research, because by undermining and cutting out the legs of research done in the West, they made it ever more difficult to conduct research in the West, and therefore has left the terrain open to basically what I would say are ideological enemies to the West. And this is where I want to sort of keep emphasizing to people that as much as we want to hold our, we have this clean house with respect to, I think I've just posted all links in chat, but the surrendering of these advantages that we had, that our fathers, I suppose, and grandparents left to us, and we surrendered the grounds to, on the fact that there was just in terms of the science, from a science perspective, there was a great deal of hubris by scientists, in the late 90s and in the early noughts, where it was, we figured we were close to mapping the human genome. We'd mapped the genomes of other animals, and then we thought that with that we would be able to tackle all things under the sun, and that just turned out to be a fantastically naive way of thinking about biology. And you can't the idea that it's just genes per se and everything just comes down to genes are it's simplistic thinking, right? And I'm sort of sidetracking from the point I wanted to say, and that is that we in the West have surrendered all the technical advantage we had with respect to the type of research that could be done, because people found it distasteful. It it hurt their feels that something as incorrigible as animal testing could be done, and we're paying the price for that now, because there's just an axiom that if it can be done, it will be done, and so it it was done then by the Chinese, and the thing is, it put us into a position where we started funding them to do the research for us. And you can be damn sure that as these programs have they do involve gain of function type research. They also are dual use, and any sort of endeavor, especially scientific endeavor in China, you're dealing with the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army, and as bad as you think we are in the West, the Chinese are infinitely worse in any respect, with in terms of human rights and their disregard for human beings. So I'll sort of stop there. I don't want to be monologuing all the time.
Yeah, no, well said, Doc McCairn. I hope you guys like my photos I was trying to add as you were talking. But yeah, if you have any other research papers you want to share, Doc McCairn, during our chat tonight, just feel free to send them over, because I know people in the comments wanted the link, so I posted the link to that paper in the comments, which a couple of people did appreciate.
So yeah, I mean, as I'll let Jonathan sort of look, and I'll start. I mean, I should have them saved, but my desktop is a thing of chaos right now, and
I'm always down here in the basement away from the children. I don't have my laptop here.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. You have to be you're like the antipode of the sweaty. I forget the word that they use, but what's the how do they describe the young kids who can't get girlfriends in the basement? You have to be the
incel.
Incel, that's right. Yeah. So Jonathan is the antithesis of that. With so you're sitting on sort of plot of a few acres and a house and with a wife and family, yet you're in the basement.
Yeah. Exactly.
Is the anti-incel.
But please let me just sort of get my see if I can find these papers. But I mean, the message in them was clear, and I don't know if Jonathan can speak to Koch's postulates with respect to disease and transfective agents, and then that might sort of.
Gosh, he's giving me a test. That's terrible. As far as I understand that goes, it's something pretty simple. It's something that biologically makes sense and should make sense to anybody with like an 8th grade biological background. The idea would be, if you have somebody who's sick and you think that they're getting sick because of something in their mucus, then one very nice way to prove that would be to take that mucus and smear it on somebody who's healthy, and then have them get sick in exactly the same way that you were sick, show the same symptoms, develop the same course of infection and recover in the roughly same way, and then you'd have some pretty good evidence that the agent or the antigen, the whatever, the pathogen rather, that's causing the disease would have been in the mucus that you used to demonstrate this. So then this would go all the way down to really being able to purify the virus and give that virus to someone else. And when you give it to somebody who's healthy, they develop the same set of symptoms. And so in theory, this should work. But the trouble is, if this virus somehow can evoke a different bouquet of symptoms depending on the order in which the tissues it infects are attacked. And so if the typical progression is one where the infection starts in the lungs or the throat, and you're asymptomatic for 5 days, and then it goes deeper in your lungs and you get pneumonia, and then you have to go to the hospital, and the ventilators aren't really good for you, and the ventilators do more damage, and a lot of those people die, then that's one thing. But if the course of the infection is very variable, when, for example, the person first loses their sense of smell and has a very dry cough, but no real fever or anything else, and then the next thing that happens is that they can't breathe and they land up face down in the pavement because the virus progressed from being in their sinuses to being in the brain with none of the things that happen deep in the lungs, then again, Cook's postulate becomes less relevant in this scenario, because not less relevant, but then you're forced to recapitulate also the infection course. So did it primarily hit your sinuses first? Did it primarily hit your deep nasals first? Or did you first get it by ingesting it? And that could be another way that the viral infection manifests itself, and that makes it even more difficult for the doctors then to diagnose it, because then the viral load will be different and spread in different tissues depending on where you are and when it started. And that becomes quite complicated if the virus is using different methods of entering cells. So it's really tricky right now, the number of unknowns. I don't know how.
Yeah, go on, finish your thought, Jonathan.
No, that's it. That was it, really.
Yeah, so I would sort of expand on that by tying it into the current social mix by saying that right now, because of the devil's bargain that's being played out in the US, where and I would say my own view towards immunization are, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I think vaccines have a important place to play in the armamentarium of medicine. That I can understand why some people can feel that the governments and state and federal authorities are overstepping the bounds by demanding that people take or they're forced to go under a vaccine schedule that I would say is quite severe in the United States anyway. And then what seems to be, if we want to sort of push straight out to the edge, is that the people who were boycotting and having a demonstration in Michigan, obviously they have concerns with respect to the fact that Castro God is here, so we can get an explanation for PCR, Castro God. But I'll just laze you straight away, sir, as Castro God is someone who doesn't believe that viruses exist and doesn't understand the idea that Koch's postulates have been demonstrated, and as soon as you can demonstrate them in a animal of test or passage, Koch's postulates are satisfied. It's been done for years with SARS and primates. There's papers coming out as of this week with respect to the new strain of SARS, and the whole premise of there being no such thing as an infective virus is, you're just at a level of being duped, where should you just avoid this particular bullet through luck, if your incredulity or credulity, I should say, not incredulity, but allows you to,
I think.
sorry.
I think it's incredulousness.
Yeah, whichever way he was afraid. But well, you know, to me, if you're thinking that reality is so rubbery and so slippery that you can have a uh, uh, you can believe the Earth to be flat, viruses are not real, and everything is all a conspiracy, then there's not going to be much hope for you with respect to sort of navigating. Um, uh, as a Kaufman fan at first, but he's not, to be frank. Well, like I say, he dropped Dr. Cowan, so he's another sort of no virus individual, and on the Discord earlier. And you know, if you can't even be bothered to do the most cursory of investigation, which is, well, if you want to start saying that SARS hasn't complied with Koch's postulates, go and check it, and don't go being duped by why is Kevin being a liar? In what respect am I being a liar, Castrogard? I'll screenshot all your stuff that you dropped into my Discord if you want. We'll put that up, and
Don't feed the trolls, Kevin.
it's not that I like whole troll hunting, and if we can.
Well, that's different than that.
And I'll just put a link to my Discord, and you can see where he's put in Dr. Thomas Cowan, Dr. Thomas Cowan is an individual that believes that the heart doesn't pump blood, okay, and there's some other sort of physiology going on. And look, I don't have a problem with thinking that biology is an electrical phenomenon first. The wet biochemistry that we see associated with it is the sort of framework that instantiated. But in that respect, you're just in a chicken and the egg. One needs the other. You can't just isolate one. And no, let him. No, it's good to let them sort of come out into the open, because then you can address the questions. And I would say this is probably a bit more informative for the general public than us sort of just bringing up citations for papers, because then that becomes a bit of a sort of technical slog, and I'm not sure how useful it is. But as I like I say, my my Discord looks like it's been sort of popping since it's first. That's what it always tells me. So I'm going to copy his link. So this is who, as I busted Kaufman, one of his main planks had been taken away with respect to saying that viruses aren't real. Here's one of his second fallbacks, and he wants to rely on but let's, like I say, we'll go through the infectious myth, and we'll copy that link and we'll go through it and we'll start dismantling it. And you know, Koch's postulates a bit like trying to argue against the law of gravity. Now, if you want to come forward with new and exciting models for gravity, and you've done the research and you've done the thinking and the study to sort of come up against breakdowns in the experimental paradigm, and you've got something coherent to say, then I'm all ears, because I want to hear from people like this. People who just watch a YouTube video and do some degree of what they think is due diligence by Kizzy. I love Kizzy. Kizzy sort of hangs around my Discord, and
Oh, you know Kizzy too?
yeah. She's very funny. Her Dragon, they're all very funny, and
I was wondering where she came from. She was commenting last week on one of my videos. I was chatting with her a little bit.
Yeah, so she's one of we're all fans of one Davy Crocco. He's the progenitor of grifter busting, and it's where I would have done things in writing. I've always done things in writing for that respect. I've suddenly found this whole new meaning in life by doing the things on YouTube and doing it in video format. So and it's way easier to take on these people in real time, I find, because you can then start to address the concerns. And so, yeah, you want to come here and ask about real-time PCR because there's another sort of central tenet of the viruses aren't real. Is that reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction cannot be used to identify viruses. Right now, maybe I know sort of Jonathan has more sort of experiences with viruses than myself. I'm pure electrophysiology and behavior, but the because at its time when it first came out in the 80s, the inventor of the RT-PCR method basically said that it's very difficult to it shouldn't be used for diagnostic for aiding in the diagnosis of disease, and that's sort of stuck, and it's become like one of those well, it's a saying that people who want to take up a contrary position have glommed onto. The technology has moved a long way forward since then, and I had a sort of discussion with Paul on Thursday as the guest on my stream, and he could probably answer it better than myself as well. And look, okay, so here's to help you, Castro. Okay, now an individual from Guatemala was calling me because they were having patients that were dropping down, healthy patients, young patients. If you think that you will get to him, you don't know me very well, Castro. If you think that these sort of things are going to phase me, you're just going to be in for a hard time, brother. But he wrote to me saying that they're having problems getting the real-time PCR to work. RT-PCR, not real-time. And what they sort of rely on is the fact that in order to do RT-PCR, is that you have to cut the genome into segments, and then you have to have primers that sort of go onto the cut segments that you've identified, where you culture the virus. So get that, Castro. I don't have to call you brother. I can just call you wanker if you like, but brother seems more appropriate for public discourse. But if you prefer wanker, that's fine by me. That you essentially snip up the DNA or RNA, depending on which you have to work with, and then you have to have primers, and your primers have to be somewhat selective for the bits of RNA that you're interested in. And loudmouth like, yeah, so good. Start getting under your skin, Castro. You'll see. And as that happens, you then begin the expansion. But this individual from Guatemala, and Guatemala is essentially, I don't know if you'd say third world, but probably floating between second and third. And yeah, you know what? I've offered Castro to come in and speak things in real time, but like Kaufman, he'll run away because he knows that he'll just get he's not going to be able to hang. So he's got a couple of talking points. So we've bust Kaufman apart with respect to that you can't isolate viruses and you can't see them, and that's what his other little go-to point is the Thomas Cowan individual, and the and you know people.
Okay, so I just want to. I don't know who this guy is that you're fighting, but there's some. We can make some arguments here, right? Like, for example, let's just flip this around. If you were gonna take cells from the brain of a monkey and you were going to use real-time PCR, because I do think it's real-time PCR, not reverse transcriptase PCR. And the real-time PCR refers to the many cycles that they do, and they watch for which cycle the amplification starts, and the earlier cycles mean that there were more copies to begin with in the initial sample. So when you're doing these kinds of samplings in a laboratory, you wear gloves and everything because you're afraid of the RNases that are on your skin. And you don't want the RNases of your skin to get in your sample because they'll degrade the RNA that you want to amplify in your PCR sample. So there's a lot of reason to believe that contamination and everything else is not something you want. You have to get this all out of there. And false positives are a real problem if, for example, I take neurons from a mouse brain and I want to say that the layer 5 pyramidal cells that I pulled out of my slices have nicotinic receptors in them, and the fast spiking interneurons that I pulled out of mine don't have nicotinic receptors. People won't let me get away with just one set of primers for each of those groups. And if I get positive results or negative results and then just go with it, I'm going to have to do several controls, and I'm going to have to use primers that aren't going to work, and I know they're not going to work, and at least couple different copies of primers, different primers that amplify the same RNA, but then different parts of it after digestion. So the point is that I have questions about how many primer sets are they using to determine the positive results from a given patient. How many times?
How many controls they have, you mean?
It is how many controls. It's how many, legit measurements are they taking? Because to take just one sample and run it 40 times on a real-time PCR machine, the odds of getting something to eventually amplify are actually pretty good, like higher than 50%. And because you've gone enough cycles, eventually it amplifies and some product is produced. That product might not be the right one, but the point is there's lots of room for bullshitting around if the end result is not what you get from a real-time PCR machine in a real laboratory, which would be a curve, which would indicate the size of the product, and the size of the product should be predicted. And all of these things are done with a very large machine the last time that I did it. And I don't think that I don't know that there is a technology which would allow you to have a pregnancy-like test where you simply swab and get a plus or minus, and they're behaving as though such a test exists. I think even when they get results, the results a lot of times would be within a certain margin of error that they're going to have to decide, okay, is this a significant result or not? And if it's not this way, I'm trying to understand it, and I find it impossible to. The details are very hard to find, and this should be a relatively easy test to explain. The primer should be publishable. The sequence, all the process should be very easy to explain, because the process itself molecularly is easy to understand. So all that I've emailed people, I've tried to figure out what is the standard test, how accurate would it be from my perspective, but they can't even give me details which would allow me to even make a ballpark. And that frustrates me a lot.
Well, I don't know who you've been talking to. And again, this is, people do have to understand that scientists are human beings, and most human beings, well, if we want to keep the language a bit more tempered, then everyone has flaws, and the what might be a obvious question for us, and if you're asking, if someone was asking me every day in my inbox, what's the basis for making the resistance on the tip of an electrode, and how do I get an electrode into the brain? And I had to sort of answer that every day, multiple times a day. I would lose patience as well, because I do think, and I've been using this phrase this week because I think it's important. So, as ignorance of the law is no defense, ignorance of science shouldn't be a defense, and you have to, in some extent, if you're going to start jumping on what would be the more extreme outliers of any sort of study or endeavor. So the classic one being right now, no viruses.
That's not what I'm saying, man. I'm just saying that.
No. I'm not sort of. I was just sort of moving on from what you said. It wasn't a comeback onto you, Jonathan.
I just wanted to say something on what Jay said. That is, I think, a really critical piece of information. I did not know that the test was not that simple as a binary yes or no. There's actually, from what I understand from your explanation, Couey, is that there's a degree of variability and well, I guess to be honest, I've taken calculus but not stats, so I don't know if it's reliability or validity over a long period.
So let me just say it. I can try and explain it to you in a cartoon sort of sense to give you an idea.
Am I picking it up right? It sounds like that's what I heard, but maybe you can explain it again a little simpler.
Well, when you run this test, you are taking a very short sequence of a very short genetic sequence, and you're letting it find a reasonable match for itself. And you're relying on the relative specificity of DNA such that it doesn't just, it's not just going to go together with anybody and hang out. It's going to try and make the best possible match.
Best marriage. Yeah.
And
okay.
The idea is that if you choose the right sequence, number one, if you choose the right sequence, it won't wrap up on itself. So you got to make sure that the sequence doesn't have enough homology with itself that it won't just connect to itself and then not do anything. So you also have to have a sequence that's specific enough for this coronavirus that it doesn't react with other coronaviruses. And there's not a good way to know right now, but you assume that they're taking care of that part, and they're trying to choose sequences which are sufficiently specific for this coronavirus that they would only react with this one. But that's, again, quite tricky to know for sure to what extent a part of the genome of another coronavirus, when digested, would not produce a fragment that would also amplify with these And once it's amplified once, you get a positive result. Even if the initial match wasn't perfect, once it's gone through one cycle, all of the copies are now the same. So when you amplify those copies and you get a product, and that results in a positive result. And so when you use this as a measurement tool in science, you have to do many controls to prove that the positives you get are really positives. I've heard from many different sources that there's no such thing happening here, and everybody who's positive is positive, done. That's it. And I don't think it's that simple.
So, and this seems to me to be a pretty basic part of, I mean, scientific method and scientific testing.
Yeah, but they're kind of, it's definitely is, but when you take a swab from somebody's nasal cavity, it's not like you're only going to get the coronavirus or no viruses.
Right.
You're going to get a crap ton of viruses, no matter whether they're coronavirus or not. You know, this particular one or not, there's going to be viruses there. There's going to be bacteria there. There's going to be your own proteins there, blood in there, and white blood cells in there. And then all of those things need to be somehow separated and purified and digested so that you can then test these primers on them to try and amplify RNA that is virus specific and separate that from RNA that's from your cells, RNA that's from the bacteria, and RNA that's from the viruses that are there that are not COVID-19. So it's quite a complicated little trick to just go, and then ding, you win or you lose. That's a pretty complicated thing. It's not to say that it can't be done with many different things, but with this coronavirus, there's going to be some error there. The question is, what is the error? You know,
some false positives.
Yeah.
And I would add to that usually under such circumstances, on a year by year basis, a degree of projection is made with how much you're going to need certain facilities, and so there will be X amount of machines in the hospital or in the state or wherever that you have access to, or private labs. And there's also if you want to, like Jonathan says, there's a way, there are methodologies that you have to go through and hoops you have to jump through to make sure that you're getting towards the something approximating a clean sample for the test. And if you are if suddenly all your infrastructure comes massively under strain because of an unknown pathogen, like it's not unknown, but a new variant of SARS has popped its head up.
It's an unknown variable.
Yeah, and like I say, it's not and there are antibody tests apparently. China's been selling them, but apparently they, the quality control is somewhat Chinese, for a better description. But the fact that people want this instantaneous set of results, we've become spoiled in a way to expecting things to work like that, right?
So because of what you guys and what Jay just said and what you just said, Doc McCairn, we cannot realistically expect a mail-in test.
Not yet. That I would say it's coming. It wasn't that long.
The part of that evidence is there. It's crazy, right? When this first started and we were having trouble testing people in America, if you were paying attention on Twitter, there were thousands of molecular biology labs that were gearing up to do testing, and they were proposing primers. They had tests ready to go, yada, yada, yada. And the FDA and the CDC wanted nothing to do with those people. They wanted nothing to do with them, and they blamed it on bureaucracy and the rules that were in place and yada yada yada. But the bottom line is, I think a lot of these people were independent scientists, and they don't want that. Like they want to control the entire narrative, and there's some other agenda at hand here. And I don't think it's just public health. That's the problem. If it's preserving the quote unquote economy or whatever it is, I don't know, but it bothers me a lot, because I don't think that what's happening in New York had to be as bad as it is. I know that we can't do anything about it now, but we're going to have to come back and look at it. Heads are going to have to roll because people made bad choices.
Yeah, and those bad choices go back years and years, because that just ties back into the previous topic that we were talking about before being interrupted, and that is the use of primates in medical testing. Once you dismantle infrastructure like that, where you can you've got enough of a distributed infrastructure, so you're not just relying on one place and one group, and virtually every state should have a primate center. It should be considered part of your strategic planning for such events like this.
And look at you, Doc. I mean, you're English, but you're in Japan because of your work. Your work brought you there, right?
Yeah, because there's no way that I would get support for the degree of invasiveness that my experiments required. And I have to do it on awake behaving animals, so it doesn't look good to the general public. But I just think a hardening of stances need to be taken by institutes and the scientists in general. So people like Logothetis just running off to China, in a way, you can sort of understand.
Is he Greek?
I want to just say.
That sounds like a Greek name, doesn't it? Like Logothetis, like.
I want to say
like Epictetus. Anyways,
I wanted to say Brazilian, but I might be. I'm confusing him with Nicolaus. But he was in Germany, and the Tübingen, that little sort of there's a sort of technology zone around there, sort of overlapping with Switzerland. But people like Logothetis are going to up sticks and go to places like China, and this is where I would have an issue with someone like Logothetis. His work is well regarded, but if he can't handle the pressure, then he probably shouldn't be in the job to begin with. And there should have been more people willing to stand up over the last 20 years and put the case forward that we do need these methods available to us, and we need everything, right? So we need it from the ex vivo, in experimental plates, in cultures, to nematodes, if you want, little worms, and we need to be checking as much as we can as possible. And into that picture needs to come the primate needs to be sort of sat there, because a big problem with the medical sciences and neurosciences, especially where you're dealing with something as complex as the brain, because it doesn't have, if you're dealing with liver disease or kidney disease, the tissues that you're dealing with tend to be less complex, and the actions and the responses of the organ less complex to try to understand if you want to try new drugs and therapies. When it comes to the brain, there's a phenomenon called the translation problem, and this ties back to what I was saying earlier with respect to scientists in their hubris, as they thought we had everything licked I didn't think that, but there were enough people with vested interests. And this is the thing to always keep in mind, that once the geneticists had thought they'd been able to say, we can define everything by, once we understand genes, then we'll understand everything. And they got all the resources. So the pharmaceutical companies poured in billions and billions of dollars. It channeled people away from other disciplines into the genetics fields. And I'm not saying it's good to have that, but those resources should be there for other disciplines as well. So we're not exposing ourselves to people who are ideologically opposed to us at a very deep level. Okay, and to see people going to China, I always resisted it. Okay, because I wouldn't buy the line that they were just a developing country and were trying to get along with it. The communist regime of China has butchered 100 million, probably more, and they will not allow us to. That's quite witty.
We'll get to China. Go back to China in a sec, Doc McCairn, if that's cool, because it's such an easy. Because I definitely want to talk about it more, and I think people want to hear us chat about it more. But we did get this question about Sweden's deaths, which I don't know if you guys have information on this. I have not been able to find, because I'm seeing conflicting info, which is like. Which it doesn't make me special nowadays. It just makes me, someone who's paying attention. But I don't know. Have you guys heard anything about Sweden?
I'll let Jonathan.
Question from Sean.
Please, Jonathan.
I haven't heard anything really new. I have friends in Norway, not in Sweden, and Norway's not really worried about it right now. I suspect we're all not going to know much until the dust settles. That's the
dust settles, yeah, until the fog of war lifts.
And that's the problem right now. Is we live in a culture of we want answers now. So it's like the PCR issue, right? That everyone expects that you just get what it is that you need. You flick a switch. And you flick the switch, and out comes the answer on the other end, bit like a calculator. And I'm old enough to remember when things like a electronic calculator was still a bit of a novelty to be able to get one into your house. Right?
You didn't have the TI-84 with you in middle school?
No, I think we had. Before then, so
the TI Abacus.
Yeah, about that. I would say.
We got this question from Judy. What about I have zero O negative blood? They say I have harder chance of getting it. Is it true?
That's another one of these things that we don't know till the stats are done properly. And right now, we don't know. Yeah. And everything I see is just. In my mind, it's sort of it's we're negating all the it's not just we're not negating, but we're just reaffirming in my mind that there's a reason why we have scientific protocols and procedures to follow, and that you go through review, so that the information that goes out in some way has been vetted. And right now, people are obviously scared, and they're casting wide nets with respect to what's going to make me safe versus what do I need to treat myself. And that's a good picture of Teddy to pick up with. And I can't answer anything to the blood type. I don't know if
Well, if Paul decides to join us later, he can definitely confirm that. But as far as I can tell from what Paul has talked about, that is true. That I think it's A that is the worst, right? And then O, any type of O blood is the best. But we can double check with him when he gets back.
Well, yeah. Again, for me, that I would just say we need much more controls being put in place before answering that in the affirmative. It's like, and jump in, Jonathan, anytime you like. But that, there's this thing with the quinine-based drugs and the publishing of data from the Didier Raoult's lab in Marseille, and he very obviously could just bulldoze a paper straight into publication. And and when you start using words like we got a 98% cure rate for our test group, and then you start digging down into his history, and this is what I keep trying to emphasize to people. You don't just look at the science, you have to look at the person that's doing the science, because you have to find out if there's any conflict of interest. And even though scientists might say they have no conflict of interest on the statement for the any manuscript they're submitting, there was enough from me just digging around for an hour or two to become suspicious of the motives of that particular doctor. And like I say, we haven't done enough right now to warrant coming to the types of conclusions that people are, or saying that we've got a cure. And I'm not even sure if we were speaking. I think we might have touched on this last week, but and I was using the example of Teva. Teva is known as the generic giant, so it waits for molecules to get out of. We seem to be watching some Islamic ladies with their surgical gowns on, and Islam is right about women, and it was right about SARS, it would seem. They're just missing the eyeglasses and the gloves. They'd be good to go in our current day and age. But anyway, I'm sort of straying from the point. But the
it'd be interesting to know whether or not the countries that have the full face coverage for their Islamic beliefs have a significantly lower spread among females, because that would be a wonderful argument against or for masks, because that's it's a wonderful population to test it in.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I had never thought of that.
Well, you have to presume though that they have the same capacity for hand washing and hygiene in those countries, and
yeah, but it's what they wear in public, right? So in public they're not spreading it. At least you would assume that there would be a significant reduction, because half their population is wearing a full coverage and not projectile breathing like all of us do.
Yeah, like I say, Islam's right about women, and Islam is right about SARS is my go-to for that one. And
could you expand on that if you want, Kevin?
That's just me making a
okay, another time
a joke. It's a joke.
Oh, okay.
I don't know. Maybe people are aware of it or not, but there was a few months back, I want to say it was in the United States, but where I don't know. But someone had gone round stapling onto lampposts and stuff, basically just plain sheets of paper that and I want to say it was a more sort of liberal enclave of the country, and it basically just said, in sort of to fill up the A4 sheet, Islam is right about women. And then you could sort of see the cognitive dissonance kicking in as they were showing it to people, because they didn't, on TV, they didn't want to be saying, they didn't want to be seen to be saying anything wrong about Islam, because that's the third rail right now with political discussion. And then they were just sort of like, it was just a funny thing to sort of watch play out. And I always like watching sacred cows of political correctness get slaughtered. And if it's animal rights loonies or political correctness Nazis, then I'm all for it. Humiliate them in every way possible. The devil hates to be mocked. So
well, here we got seeds in Michigan, which are banned from being purchased. I don't know if you guys saw this.
So this is new for me, but yeah, this is an American issue, and you guys can sort of speak. But to me, that's just bizarre posturing by the store. And
posturing, yeah, that's one way to put it.
I don't know what else. We're not banned from buying seeds in Japan. And
no, we're not here in Pittsburgh either. I didn't want to wait in line to go into Lowe's, but I could have gone into Lowe's and bought stuff.
And you said something earlier, Jay, that was really interesting to me. You sound like you're pretty active on Twitter, and you said before that there were scientists and labs willing to help independently with this pandemic. What are they saying now? What's the chatter like in that community?
Well, the vast majority of them became very disappointed because they got all excited that they might be able to help, and all of them were turned down for not having capacity, for not wanting to send infectious samples around. There were lots of different reasons, many of which were legitimate, but suffice it to say that a lot of people got fired up, got a bunch of equipment together, and I'm going to gather my departments, this stuff and that stuff, and we can do RT-PCR. But then the government said, yeah, well, we can't use you. And it's not really clear why. You can send them the primers, you can make primers, you can order primers online, they can send you them. So the primer sequences don't need to be secret. And that means that in theory, with a few reagents, and a lot of labs use PCR all the time and have the reagents, they come in kit form. There's no reason why the primers for this coronavirus couldn't have been substituted for the primers that they use in their lab for the things that they're interested in, and most of it would have been the same. At least that's what you can assume in theory. Nice picture.
It's great.
Corona Bay.
And to
but
me,
I don't think.
Go on, Jonathan, because
I don't think it's a conspiracy. I don't think that's just the shit of government. It's the
systemic.
It's more the extreme ineptitude built into a bureaucracy like that, where right now, for example, every patient that gets screened for convalescent plasma therapy in theory must be approved by the FDA before the plasma can be used by the hospital on other patients. Each patient has to be approved. It has nothing to do with the doctor's opinion, even if the doctor's taking care of both the donor and the recipient. It's absurd.
Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I would just add that sort of bizarre. It's not bizarre. It's to be expected that bureaucratic type behavior exists anywhere in the world, and I've, depending on how you want to look at it, fortunate to have to travel because of my everywhere has just its difficulties, and Japan is just as bad. They're sort of paralyzed at a sort of governmental level when it needs to initiate change, and you can, maybe it's better to sort of have those. We might just have to accept that we have those difficulties and hindrances, so that there's, in some respect, there's a degree of transparency with respect to who's doing what, because you could have the inverse, where if China decides it's going to do something, it makes sure it's done come hell or high water.
Right.
And the consequences of that are, well, we know that they're, well, do we know? But I mean, I would make the argument that they are a dragon in the East, and you would be really, really foolish to think that just because the dragon is sending you your shiny new phone at the moment, that dragon won't turn around in a fit of pique and torch you with his fiery breath. And right now, if we're going to get into something approaching hot war with respect to China, we should be very, very careful about what we wish for, right, with respect to enabling private companies. Because look, I might go on a rant a bit here. I'll try and keep it short, but I would say many of our problems in the West stem from the fact that we actively make or encourage profit making on aspects of our culture that I think should be considered more sort of public service orientated, whether it be education or hospitals. I think once you induce a profit element, you get issues like the overzealous use of vaccinations to the overzealous prescriptions of medications, and the and you see the, well, again, every country has its different faults, but I don't think big pharma as a archetype to with which to sort of say, well, we're a bit skeptical of that, is you're not stretching the bounds of credibility in that respect by saying that we do have issues with it. I'll leave it at that. Otherwise, I'll spin off onto one.
Oh no, we love it when you spin off, Kevin. But that dovetails really nicely, actually, that you guys mentioned that, just kind of the bureaucracy and the system, because it's not really related to the pandemic. But what would you guys say to someone who wants to go into the academic world, be it undergrad or grad, and they're not sure about what direction to go? Or maybe what are some facts that you guys wish you would have known at the beginning?
I'll let Jonathan go first.
Yeah, definitely.
I have to think about my words carefully here. So
I'm gonna try and make Kevin laugh. I think science is a bit like doing porn.
You made me laugh.
If you only make a couple movies and you get out, it could actually be good for your CV and you can make it work for you. A lot of people have. But if you stay in too long, it's hard to get out. It's hard to leave it behind. It's hard to remove the soul stain that it leaves on you, because it's an illusion of a meritocracy. The idea is you work really hard, you're going to climb up this ladder, but the ladder's rungs are fake, and some people's ladders move up for them, and other people's ladders rungs break as they climb. And it's not always very clear whether it was your mentor's fault or just unlucky, but it tends to be that people who get mentors that push them forward tend to get ahead in the game. And so it's a lot like everything else. If you know the right people in business, you can make it to the interesting tables right away. And if you don't know people, or for whatever reason you don't have somebody above you pulling you up, you might never make it up. And science has become more and more that way. And now science has become even darker because the inevitable, I don't know if, I think it's still called affirmative action in America, but essentially, let me just say that it would be, if you are a woman, I would say go for science right now.
Oh yeah, no doubt.
If you're what qualifies as a underrepresented minority in the United States, then I would say go for it right now, because
for sure
there's a lot of grant money that's targeted at that. There's a lot of grant money that determines whether you get a job or not. And if you could get grant money, you can stay in academics. And so right now it would be better to be a woman. It would be better to be of an represented minority. And then if you can hit it hard, you know, in your PhD, you get some good publications and come up with a nice idea and stick with it during your postdoc, and, you know, carve a little interesting niche in terms of the intellectual landscape, then you can become an academic scientist. But what you have to understand is that you're never going to be paid to you're never going to be paid to do what you actually imagined you're going to be paid to do. What you're going to be paid to do is come up with ideas that are fundable and get that funding. After that, they don't care. And so your primary job is the acquisition of government funding, and that means filling out government forms and answering government worded questions with government expected answers. And so if you're a person who can learn to play that game, you can be extremely successful as a scientist, and that's great. But if you have this sort of creativity that comes with a really good scientist, and this imaginative, you know, forward vision that comes with being a scientist, that are a real scientist at heart, then academic science might move too slowly and force you to find a too well protected place to study, and you in the end might become bored or unstimulated by it. And I'm not saying that I'm there, but I'm going in that direction in the sense of neuroscience. That's the thing that Kevin and I are in. Rodent neuroscience has kind of taken over as the predominant, you know, this is what we study. We study mice, and we use mouse brains as a model for studying human brains. And as Kevin alluded to earlier, there's just a certain gain of function that occurs as you pile on layers and layers of neurons, and as you pile on extra, you know, sub-circuits and circuits in between circuits that are present in higher mammals and in primates that aren't present in rodents. And so there's lots of things that you can approximate, because some of the circuits that are there are evolutionarily older, and so maybe some of these mechanisms are more or less preserved. But you can also make the argument that there's no biological reason that any of these mechanisms will be perfectly preserved from rodents to primates, simply because we diverged so long ago in evolution, and the pressures on our brains are so much different. And so I think in a lot of ways what's becoming very difficult for me is that in rodent physiology, I think Kevin is well aware of this, we've gotten to the stage where we can monitor the, you know, some aspect, some let's say biophysical signature of neuronal activity, be it calcium signaling or voltage signaling or even electrophysiological signals at that high time resolution. And people, when neurons fire action potentials at particular times during a behavioral task or at particular times during a behavior, the metaphor of encoding is automatically invoked, like immediately. These neurons are encoding for head direction, because whenever the animal is facing north, these neurons are firing. That kind of postulate tends to hold true. But we've now gotten to the stage in neuroscience where we start to talk about how neurons in the motor cortex that fire when the animal sees something are encoding visual information. And if neurons in the auditory cortex fire when the animal sees something, then they could be coding visual information too. And if we make a very simple linear model of this massive amount of data, we can find some neurons that linearly code vision. And so then we say that there's some neurons that linearly code vision. And essentially what you're doing is taking a very large sample of neurons and finding a very small number of neurons that agree with your hypothesis and claiming that you've found something interesting. And all of neuroscience that I'm competing with is now acting on this premise, where I'm still a patch clamp physiologist and actually have to apply drugs and see changes, and I'm doing really cellular mechanisms of things, so it's hard for me to make wacky hypotheses that can't be tested. Everything that I'm doing has to be tested and controlled and whatever, but this neuroscience stuff has really spun off into almost pseudoscience a lot of times, where they do experiments and then just make interpretations of what the stuff they saw without ever manipulating the experiment to prove that their that their interpretation of the results is valid. And it's hard to work within the context of, so many people succeeding and going on to become professors and start their own group and talk about how their science is measuring how the animal's brain encodes this or encodes that. And so much of the stuff is theoretical now without much concrete proof. And then to top that all off, we're talking about a mouse that we don't even really know what the mouse is feeling or thinking and what range of feeling or thinking a mouse has. And so we're waxing intellectual about something that we can't even understand ourselves. It would make a lot more sense for me if these kinds of things were being projected onto a primate model, simply because I think we're capable of empathetically hypothesizing about what happens in a primate brain much easier than we are empathetically hypothesizing about what might happen in the experience of a mouse.
Because we are primates.
Yes, and I've reached the stage in my career where I'm starting to regularly question all the people that I work with, simply because, wait a minute, you're talking about a mouse, right? And if they're not doing something molecular and something very mechanistic where I can believe their experiments because they're very quantitative, then it's hard for me to take anything seriously anymore. And it's
how long have you been, how deep are you into your career, Jay?
I did my PhD in 2009. I did 5 years of research science in Norway and 5 in the Netherlands, and now I'm on my 4th here in Pittsburgh.
Okay, so you're at least 20 in then.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so you're a veteran now.
Yep, and I think also I have a nice the lab that I was working in Trondheim right after I left, the director and his wife got the Nobel Prize in 2014. So I only mentioned that because I feel like I was at the peak of neuroscience when everything was very exciting and I still think pretty genuine. A lot of the things that the Mosers did with grid cells and place cells in the hippocampus and in the entorhinal cortex, I still think are quite valid observations. It's just that now we've started to try and make the same kinds of sort of encoding metaphors apply to activity in other brain regions that we have less reason to believe we understand their function. And yet we make many of the same assumptions. And so that's what's weakening neuroscience as a whole. And then, as Kevin was saying earlier, we've for a large extent also so ostracized the primate community, that it's kind of a separate neuroscience community apart from the rodents, in a similar way that Drosophila is.
What
Drosophila-
caused that ostracization?
Oh, that just comes from the institutes themselves just not wanting to support the infrastructure for primates, because it involves so much more. There's so much more external variables, and those variables basically just come down to animal rights, people, and you can't.
It's a
plan.
huge political issue.
Yeah, it's a political
And what do you
issue.
think? Just quick question, Kevin. What do you think about all the marmoset and squirrel monkey and tinier? I mean, is there any idea in your mind about, you know, what we should be? Should be trying to somehow better homogenize that? That's not the right word, but should we better try to standardize that?
I mean, homogenizing any species is going to get you in trouble, I think. But
yeah,
that's what those reds are trying to do, eh?
Yeah. Look, the Japanese went all in on the marmoset as a model to use, and I think, you know, this to me is just the inanity of sort of governmental thinking, that a country which has an endemic population of primates, so Japan is the most northerly country that has its own macaque population, and they shoot, trap, and kill 10,000 a year because they're pests, right? And but the Japanese, just in all their short-sightedness, and you know, if you ever sort of think of that stereotype of like the sort of round, very thick lensed glasses, and that's what you have to think of, a bit buck teeth maybe, as the type of people in government that are running it, and those people are the interface between the government and the science proper, that they couldn't even maintain, or they didn't fight enough for their own, to be able to use their own natural resource in monkeys, such that we're that they went all in on marmosets and all these things which were supposed to be genetic things. The low-hanging fruit of specific genetic disorders was supposed to was supposed to yield a lot of results very early on, hasn't done. And again, they poured billions in, and had they instead poured it into the infrastructure that they had in place anyway, we might have a ally with the West and America and Europe, where, you know, if and I would make the argument that primates are a necessary evil in these present times, because you can't just say we're not going to do it because someone else steps in to do it, and that those people will be the Chinese, right? And you know, I want to just as I'm doing that's just reminded me that I wanted to look at the story.
But Circle, you know, just to emphasize what you just said there, I mean, there was a not an insignificant amount of money from our NIH going to Wuhan.
Oh yeah, and this is
and
where,
the reason why it was going there, you have to question, because if it was going there to do stuff that we couldn't do on our own soil because we were worried about doing it, it would explain a lot. Why
It's so backwards.
Why weren't we funding Barrick's lab to do it? Why were we funding her to do it over there? Because the bats were over there? I mean, I'm just asking out loud, but it's sketch house.
Yeah, so the obvious answer is that they're going to be able to do those tests on monkeys, right? And monkeys just puts you that bit closer to human beings, and then gives your scientific investigation that much more validity.
But man, that's why I think that letter is so significant, though.
I mean, I would agree with you that it is, and you don't have to sort of convince me that there's
I didn't get an email from you yet with that letter, by the way.
I put links in the thing, so I'll just I will just email it to you. But if you just Google SARS and non-human primates, it'll be in the first couple of links. It sort of pops up real quick, and you just have to understand what a battleground it is for not just funding but cachet with respect to the institutes, and for the Chinese to pull it in Logothetis, right, where he basically he got chased out of Germany to go to basically it's Peking. I just want to check that again. So that's Pumu Ming, and I'm not making that name up, but it's Shanghai, not not what did I say? Peking. It's Shanghai. So there they've got 6,000 monkeys to work on, right? And they'll do what they want, how they want, when they want, and the only thing that they're thinking is that why are they being so stupid, right? They just have a very practical way of looking at life that we've given up in the West, because we surrendered our critical thinking to pressure groups and diversity mongers. And just to sort of go back to what Jonathan was saying with respect to or as a career, if you're sort of young coming into, you're sort of looking at universities and what to do, very much if you are female or what's classed as a minority group federally, you will have a much easier time of it than someone like myself who was always, that's been going on a long time. It's been going on 20 years more, but it really sort of kicked into gear in the last 15 years, I would say. 10 years, last 10 years, say. And what I saw was always diversity hires, not competence hires, and I realized that very sort of early on. So I just kept my head down and got funding where I could, and basically I sort of sacrificed myself to wanting to do the science in a way that I because I had lofty ideals going into it, that I at least satisfied that component in myself, right? And then I feel I had sort of reached the point anyway where where what I was doing had become less groundbreaking with each publication to just more iterative, and and I was sort of working on how to get to that next step before I sort of got taken out. And it's like I say, neuroscience is in this very sort of bizarre space right now, where sort of 20-25 years ago it was really in its stride and could really sort of bring answers to something which was basically considered unexplored territory and a real frontier. And we've I would say we've squandered that because we just let genetics overtake everything to the point of that's all universities wanted to do. And the thing is, the universities are happy to do that because a lot of it is mice or rats, and it's it doesn't generate the controversy that the other more sort of
that was also it too, right? That's part of the same thing you were saying before, that during the sequencing of the human genome, we kind of thought that there was going to be this gigantic breakthrough, and we were going to step by step just dismantle all of the major medical problems that stood before us. And since then, that hasn't really happened. And one of the side effects was was this huge expansion of using genetic manipulation in mice. And because it was so easy and tractable in mice, it just became the thing. And in a sort of microcosm of that, I'm sure you're aware of this, in the last, say, 5 or 10 years, the use of zebrafish for sensory calculation or sensory modality processing it's just absurd in my mind. And the whole reason why it's been expanding is simply because for a while it was the only vertebrate that you could image the whole animal at once, and that was somehow sellable as such a unique advantage for studying how a nervous system works. And it's now just proven to be absurd. Maybe there's some cool observations if you're interested in zebrafish, but I mean, we're not learning anything about sensory processing in any other vertebrate. I mean, come on.
And like I say, I'm going to be 100% on board with that. And this is where, the financials suck with respect to being sort of dropped out when I was, but I'm kind of the person anyway that, if once I felt that I was just ticking boxes, I probably would have tried to find my way to something else anyway. And so now here we are, and it's taken basically neuroscientists, so in Jonathan and myself, and I don't see many other people sort of coming forward, putting their heads above the parapet, especially as early as we did, with calling out some of the systemic issues. And
now was the time to do it, I would say.
Yeah,
I mean, because we might not have a chance in the future.
Right, and I would say now is the time that we turn our beady eye to where our science and our infrastructure has gone wrong, and we have a shining example in Dr. Fauci and the allergy and infectious diseases departments in NIH. And I would say there's probably good reason to think that as bad as Fauci's department is looking right now, I bet you if you started overturning rocks on pretty much all of it, you're going to find these sort of sketchy relationships and the nepotism and you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of mentality. And that to me is the very worst aspects of science. As if you're going to choose that as a career, you have to expect some of it, of course, but it's just got out of hand, if you want my opinion. And I know, because Jonathan's done such good work, highlighting Osterum and how these people are lying by omission because they want to cover by themselves. I want to let Jonathan speak to that, and then I'll put my piece in with what I've sort of scratched beneath the surface. But I'll put the monkey perspective in on the end.
Yeah, and I just wanted to frame it too because I wish that I had waited to go to university, and I think that it's something that young folks should really strongly consider before making that commitment, especially given the nature of the system and the bureaucracy today. That being said, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, the other thing you can do is try to assure that you don't pay a dime for it. You can definitely go to university if somebody's going to pay to go. And definitely don't do any master's degree that you have to pay to do, and don't do any PhD that you have to pay to do. Those are both too much work to be paid to do. You're donating your time, you get your degree for free. So it definitely should be something that they at least cover your expenses on. Even a PhD student in Pittsburgh is getting paid, and not that well, but they are getting paid. And so, I mean, what he's referring to is this, long bibliography of papers that we know is nice evidence that the United States and Chinese scientists and Canadian scientists and Chinese scientists and Australian scientists and Chinese scientists have been collaborating to try and understand coronavirus biology. And there's good reason to believe that they have been very meticulous in their collection and cataloging of coronaviruses around the world, because that is obviously evident from this latest barrage of papers, which oftentimes can pull, anywhere from 15 to 50 viral genomes together to compare them, that range from pangolin genes, pangolins from Myanmar and Malaysia to bats in the furthest reaches of the rural parts of northern China. And these viruses have been collected and cataloged and passaged through cells to enrich them to a high enough titer so that they could be sequenced in the first place. And just these experiments alone create a potential hazard. Now, that's to say only that it creates a potential hazard. That's to say the same thing as if you go into a forest every day and start a very small campfire, that creates some hazard for forest fire. If you go into the forest every day and create 5 bonfires and then put them out, that creates more risk than say a small campfire every night. And you could make the argument that going to every cave in China and collecting as many different bat viruses as you can, and then separating them in the laboratory and growing them through passage to significant quantities that you can sequence, is also a bit like going through a forest and setting many bonfires that don't necessarily need to burn. Now, that's not to say that our encroachment on the ever wilder areas of the world isn't exposing rural populations to more unique viruses with possibly pandemic potential, but those risks have existed for all time. And it is partly because those risks exist at the rural edges of our societies that these risks are mitigated and often not really a threat to our whole human population as a whole. And as our population gets bigger, of course, the insulation between the urban areas and these rural populations gets smaller, and so the potential for outbreak is higher. But my primary objection is that the scientists who are given the most media mic time are scientists that very consistently say the same set of half denials that we do not have evidence that this is a laboratory virus. There is no evidence to say that this came from a laboratory. There is no evidence to believe that this was a bioweapon. And those are the same words that all of them use. There's no other explanation for it. Not one of them ever says, although we have done extensive research over the last decade and a half on coronaviruses and purified them and made chimeric viruses of them and done lots of research to understand how the different pieces of this viral genome work together to result in a successful virulent strain. But we are sure that this is a natural virus because of X, Y, and Z. No one has come out to say those words because those words wouldn't be genuine, I guess. That's my best guess. Those words would not be legally defendable. They would not be the truth. They're not defendable because they're not the truth. But the words that there is no evidence for this being a man-made virus is legalese in my mind. That's all it is. It's legalese. It's not even genuine scientific language. It's legalese because generally speaking, when scientists say that there's no evidence for something, then they would call for or propose experiments that would prove it otherwise. And that's one of the things that they claim to have done. But, they don't have the intermediate animal. I'll give you, there was a paper that came out recently that people talked about. I don't know if that was one of the things that just came up in the chat or not, but paper a week ago or so that says that there are these short sequences called CpG dinucleotide repeats that can occur in the viral genome. We have several proteins inside of our cells called zinc finger proteins, and some of these zinc finger proteins target these CpG dinucleotide repeats in viral genomes, has a way of eliminating them before they're able to pass from the cytoplasm to the nucleus and hijack the nuclear translation material or translation machinery. So the more of these CpG repeats there are, the easier it is for our genome to detect viral genomes and eliminate them before they're able to successfully hijack the nuclear machinery. Interestingly enough, this virus supposedly has a relatively low ratio of these CpG repeats, which makes it harder for our own cellular machinery to identify this genome as foreign and eliminate it. And this author, interestingly enough, takes this crazy left turn and says that the coronaviruses that grow in canines, the coronaviruses that grow in dogs, also are surprisingly deficient in CpG dinucleotide repeats. Therefore, the intermediate animal must be a dog. And so this caused an uproar for a little while, like a day and a half or so, because everybody thought, oh, there it is. See, now we figured it out. Now you guys can all shut up. It was definitely the market, and it was just bats, and somehow the virus got into dogs, and then obviously it's very easy how it got from dogs to humans because they're domesticated. And this is a problem because one thing that is shown clearly in this paper, but not even addressed at all, is that way on the far depleted side of CpG repeats is way past SARS-CoV-2 are all of the human respiratory coronaviruses, including the common cold, including this OC56 and the other HC, whatever all of these respiratory viruses that are alpha coronaviruses are all extremely low in these CpG repeats. So my immediate interpretation of this paper was exactly the opposite. And I know I'm not a virologist, so, I'm just shooting from the cuff here, but he wanted to very quickly, this single author very quickly in the discussion wants you to jump to the conclusion that he has found the zoonotic link between the bats and the humans, the dog. And of course, the other explanation that I see is that you would, if you were trying to select for a virus that would pass easily through the human immune response, or alternatively might evoke a similar human immune response as the common cold, one thing you might do is test whether or not the ratio of these CpG repeats has any implications for the function of the virus. And so you might have already screened for these variants and already looked for these variants and enriched for the ones that were closer to the human common cold coronaviruses. And so that would be one reason why this virus might be significantly less or significantly depleted in these motifs as compared to the first SARS, because they enriched for it, not because it passed through dogs. And the passing through dogs problem is that the rest of this virus has nothing to do with canine coronaviruses. So it's an absurd sort of discussion point to throw out there, but it makes for a real convenient media bullet point to say, hey, look, this paper suggests that it's dogs. Oh, that's explainable. And no one ever digs into the weeds enough to realize that if even in figure 3, he shows that clearly that this indicates that's what the difference is between SARS and SARS-CoV-2. If you just look at these CpG repeats, is they've taken SARS and they've enriched it to have less of these in its genome. That's pretty creepy.
Yeah, and it can be. You can start going a lot further with that line of thinking right now, because it's all right thinking, well, they're out looking for specimens in the wild, and it's all for the good of humanity to try and sort of, and the scientific endeavor itself that they're doing. That they're doing these things, and the issue is that once, and this is why surrendering to the primate infrastructure is such a mortal blow for our culture.
It's a blunder in terms of chess.
Yes, it's more than a blunder. It's you just knocking down your king and walking away, and just giving up the game, right? Because you've just given everything over to people that would do you harm, right? And as Jonathan was sort of alluding to, once you, so those sort of molecular signatures, which would sort of indicate that there were sort of shuttle molecules between how you passage genes in and out of nucleic acid sequence. Once you start getting nature to do that for you, and so most people, so in the West, we would be thinking about rodents, but then, and I suppose rodents, that includes civets and ferrets and what have you. You have you have a set of tools available in an organism that's going to do stuff for you in such a way, in an efficient way, that we've only just begun to scratch the surface of. Now, once you've brought monkeys into the mix, right, you don't have to start looking for any intermediate host, right? Because the genome similarity is so close that it as to almost be negligible, I would say, at this sort of level of manipulation. And as I said, I was just looking at the facility where I said they've got 6,000 non-human primates. You don't have to. It doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to think, well, okay, we take 100 monkeys. No one's not going to even notice. They probably lose that many each year, right? Just from leaping over barriers or getting out of cages, especially if they're Chinese cages. And once you're in that territory, you've gone, all bets are off, right? Because we don't know, because one, it means that animal then becomes a host population. You can be pretty sure that once it's got out, and I guess we have to start doing some muckraking in a little bit, and we'll start sort of naming names again. But the you can talk about all the sophisticated techniques you want, and whether they seem viable, or whether you can or can't find fingerprints in the genome which would indicate as such. But once the monkeys got into the equation, that's it. You're done, and it's done and dusted. And now we literally just have to live with it, and we have to find the best way to live with it.
Do you guys think that this, if we do end up on the other side of this, still wearing some blue, do you think that the education system will change, or it will just take an implosion, or both? I don't know.
You know what, Jonathan, you're in a university environment right now, so I'm going to let you answer that, and I'll use that as my excuse to nip to the bathroom real quick. But
I'll pull you off real quick, Kev.
Yeah, okay. I have very.
I don't really know how to answer that question. That's super bizarre. I mean, right now it feels very much like those decisions are out of our control. I mean, we don't have adequate knowledge. We don't have accurate knowledge right now. So and I've always been a proponent of the truth not being given away for free on TV. And so, you know, when PBS NewsHour doesn't give me a single epidemiologist in a month, then I don't know. I mean, if the only guy we can listen to is Fauci, it's troublesome to me. It's not to say that I think necessarily he's a bad guy, but I don't necessarily know if for sure that there's not a pistol under the table as he's speaking to the camera. And I don't know. I just, to me, there's a lot of unknowns that right now I think we need to keep doing things like what you're doing, and that's trying to connect as many people through the raw internet as possible, so that in the event that this should speed up in a direction that we decide we don't want, we can at least act more collectively than we could have 5 or 10 years ago, should this have happened then.
Definitely, man. And we should do a collab this coming week, even if it's only like 20-30 minutes for a chat or something.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that they control the narrative on television right now, but there's so many, you know, under 40 people that are not on the TV very much, and so that their control is less than they portray on television. And I think if you don't allow yourself to buy into their extreme narrative, and you try to do a little critical thinking for yourself, it's not that there's something fake going on here, but I do think there's good ways to take care of yourself. I do think there's great reasons to wear masks, especially when, I think one of the epidemiologists that I've been trying to follow for a while now, and seems to be pretty consistent in what he's been saying, has been saying that masks are not to protect the wearer, but to protect you from asymptomatically infecting somebody else, and assuming that everybody is asymptomatic. And that, I think, is the best way to assume it. And if you're on a crowded public transportation now in New York, you have to wear a mask. And we just changed it now at the University of Pittsburgh. Those of us that are going in and still working in the labs, we have to wear a mask while we're in the common areas. And I just think it's smart. It's such a small inconvenience relative to stay home for 6 weeks.
Yeah, right.
And I think that investing
or to getting
money,
sick.
Yeah, I mean, but let's be brutally honest. Giving $1,200 to everybody didn't really go very well either, simply because I know that most of the people who needed it most, for whatever reason, did not file taxes in the traditional, direct deposit my refund sort of way. Even if you went through H&R Block, you weren't going to get your money right away because you got a check sent to H&R Block, and H&R Block took their cut. So they knew already that this rollout was going to be ugly, and the people who got the money, a lot of them didn't even need it. The ones who needed it most are still fighting to get it, waiting for their check in the mail. So the awkwardness is still carrying on. And for me, trying to predict, the epidemiologists that I'm following are also saying that most of the places closed too early, so that means we're going to get a double bump for sure. So that could mean lots more working at home. And for me, I'm ashamed at how painless that is, because I've got kids to take care of, and it's an excuse to be a dad, and my work is flexible enough that most of it I can transition to do at home. I'm trying to finish my experiments now that I had left over because I can, because this place is empty. But there's lots more people that are going to suffer much harder from this because their restaurant is closed, or their business can't open, or the place that they work can't open, or the restaurants that bought the milk aren't buying the milk anymore, or the restaurants that bought the cheese and the produce aren't buying the produce anymore, and all that's changed and impacted so many people. And I think this is going to be knock on through the summer, and then if we have another bump, I don't know what to say. I want my kids back in school. I want my kids socializing with other children again and hanging out with other adults again, just the way it's supposed to be too. So I want all those things, but biologically they may not be possible because of the decisions that weren't made, and the poor decisions that were made, and the natural consequences of the unknowns of this virus still. So I don't know.
Yeah, I would.
The kids and I are taking up archery now as part of our FIED at home. That's my solution to the pandemic.
There you go. Hey Jay, are you minority? Just going back to real quick to what we're talking about with affirmative action and stuff.
I'm not a underrepresented minority because I'm not pure blood of anything. That's my problem.
Oh, okay. You're look like native blood?
I look like native, but I have Filipino blood in me and tall white man in me too. So it's whatever. I don't know. It helps. I'm 6 foot. I'm 6'6", so it. People get everything, but they always think Indian after I stand up.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, don't get him drunk because he'll be good at boxing. He'll scalp you, and then
he's got that reach. He's 6'6".
Yeah, got the
but I have to go to bed. But thank you very much. If you want to do it next week, we can do it again for sure.
Definitely, Jay. For sure. Thanks for joining.
Up for it.
Appreciate it.
Definitely.
Have a good night.
Good to see you, Kevin. Stay in touch.
Take it easy. You too, brother.
Cool. Well, yeah, Kev.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
I don't know what was said there with respect to the universities, but and
he just kind of gave a rundown summary of basic thoughts on the virus. Talked about masks and the importance of wearing that and protecting yourself and others through that, and how it's really small inconvenience in terms of asymmetric risk and with regards to prevention and everything really. And Jay made the point of the lockdown too, of that being the trade-off for the lockdown lifting would be everyone wearing masks.
And with that I would agree, and this is where you're sort of getting into this idea of, at what point do you make a response, and how? I mean, obviously you don't want to be the Communist Party and their treatment of their citizens, and it's not just the treatment of their citizens. We're getting a good measure of how the Chinese will treat foreigners, And I would just point out to the researcher that we were talking about at the beginning, who's Logothetis, who's gone to China with Pu Muming, and these are the type of people that I would claim probably shouldn't be in the job or the position they have, because they haven't, to me, demonstrated the type of mental toughness that I think you need. And you know, you don't you want for the leaders of any particular undertaking to be somewhat war torn, with for want of a better vernacular, that they've been through the system and had to fight the system in such a way as that they can understand the viewpoint of each side in this equation. And if Logothetis now goes to China and sets up a lab there, I think right now that the Chinese authorities need to be held into account. As much, look, you'll hear me talk about cleaning house as much as the next one, especially with respect to the Fauci fiefdom and Fort Detrick, all these places. But right now, there needs to be some, because in if you take a step out and you try to sort of do a much broader calculation, of what the cost is with respect to opening places back up, and say that it is some engineered strain that's had things put into it that we're not sure how they interact, and the mere fact that we don't even understand the effects on the brain, it means that we have to, I say, still err on the side of caution, right? And yes, I think, okay, wearing a mask would seem to be the obvious choice. It's of minimal inconvenience, right, for you to go into a store and don a mask so you're not breathing on everyone else's foodstuffs, right? And the same for the anywhere else you would go in public. And I obviously restaurants and all those sort of small businesses are going to suffer, but in my mind right now, if we're biting the bullet for that line of reasoning or intervention, because we were too slow off the mark with respect to actually doing something, and there we have to look at the World Health Organization. I'm very happy that the president has withdrawn funding for the World Health Organization.
I agree.
I think brilliant move, and I think I can be very critical of people, but praise should be given where it's due as well, and that was a good move on their behalf. And if I was sort of trying to do any sort of if I was to try to do any sort of medium to long-term planning, it might just be the case that getting rid of Fauci right now before the election in, well, it's still a long way away, right? There's a long.
I guess it is. You still got the whole summer,
right? But I'm honestly of the mind that an example needs to be set and those funding departments of the NIH need some sort of they need to be held to account in some way. And as much as I would like to court martial Fauci, I was speaking with my friend the other day, and you obviously have to get that to stick in a legal court, but for sure it'll be a long summer, Marie. That much is certain. But for sure there are mechanisms within the NIH to say that we can put Fauci's department under review. And once under review, we already know in the public domain that that 2 of the years that the R01 funding to the Wuhan lab was in place, that that comes under disciplinary review, and well, I guess try and do it as fair as possible. But the fact that there were 2 years bad reporting from there, and the fact that the consequences have been so dire for everyone, that the Fauci shouldn't just think he's walking off into the sunset with a big massive pension, right?
Yeah.
That's got to be made clear straight away, because all those other people that are lining up to take the places of these people, because he must be in his last sort of years, he must be at the end of his career, that they at least take warning from the current situation, and they are more circumspect with how they treat foreign funding to labs. And why was it always so difficult to get my research funded when it had direct applicability to helping children, whereas something as dubious as coronaviruses and the gain of function, it's both things. It's gain of function and dual use. Okay.
Yeah.
My view is that perhaps we should be setting an example in how we do our funding and research. And one is addressed. So another big thing that needs to come up is just the waste. It's disgusting how much waste goes on with respect to.
You mean money?
Yeah. And the recycling of equipment needs to be better. You need to stop this idea of pigs feeding at the trough mentality. And right now I would say it's out of control. And I could go through everything root and branch.
Let's do that this week, Kevin. Let's wrap up here, and let's try to plan for something this week with just me and you, because we actually haven't done that since our first collaboration we did together. So
sure,
yeah, we could focus on what you're talking about specifically.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll be a slash and burn kind of guy. It's not going to be a nuanced. It's not going to be a nuanced conversation, or it's just going to be me going into diatribe probably. But
well, regardless, we can start off with the science, and we'll probably end up there anyways.
Okay.
Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and thanks for the questions too, guys. That really adds to the panel a lot. So we will be going on again next week, same time.
Yeah.
And look be on the lookout for that on Saturday. Cheers.
All right. Thank you very much.